Good morning everybody. It's a little bit of a slow start this morning. Welcome all of you. Well, after such a remarkable day yesterday, where we actually began to sketch a mind map at the onset of the Former West project's long-term research, and indeed realized again, I need to say, just how massive and complex a task is actually before us. But at the same time, the keynotes and discussions of yesterday confirmed our hope that the project might perhaps be able to serve as a kind of synthetic platform within which very different strains of ideas and approaches can enter into a dialogue and even perhaps a productive confrontation about the global histories of our immediate past, as well as about what other possible futures we might be able to envision together. While yesterday we had outlined the large scope of our interests, today we turn our gaze to the field of art and its discourses in relation to the world at large, situating the discussions between three pivotal markers, 1989, 2001 and 2008. This morning on the news on Dutch television it was announced that today is National Good News Day. Well, despite this cheery designation, I'm sorry to announce that Georg Scholhammer, who was supposed to deliver a keynote this morning, is not able to be here with us today. But the good news is that Cosmin Costinaş will join the first conversation scheduled for today between Pablo Lafuente and Tom Holert. And this new construction, I believe, will allow us to involve all of you to pose questions and engage with the three of them already this morning. I would like to encourage you to enter the conversation whenever you feel like that. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce four people, in fact, today. I want to thank art historian and curator Nathalie Sonnenberg for being the reviewer for today's Congress session. Sonnenberg holds an MA in art history from Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, where she lectures in the art history department and is currently working on a PhD entitled Representing Conceptual Art Between Democratization and Commodification. Since 2004, she's curator of art projects in the public space of Leidse Rijn, a housing estate area in Utrecht where she has organized projects by artists such as Monica Bonvicini, Stanley Brown, Estra Ersen, Monika Sosnowska, and Atelier van Lieshout. Sonnenberg is also associate editor of Manifesta Journal Amsterdam. She has organized numerous curatorial projects, contributes to art catalogues and artist books, and writes for publications such as Kaleidoscope, Metropolis M, and Tube Light. Sonnenberg lives and works in Amsterdam. Thank you, Nathalie, for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce to you three speakers this morning who will engage in conversation on art and its discourses and the world at large, as announced. Cosmin Costinaş is curator at the BAK, Basis voor Actuele Kunst, since early 2009, where he recently curated the exhibition Surplus Value by Mona Watamanu and Florine Tudor, a show we invite you to visit during the Congress, and co-edited with Jill Winder the first monograph on the artist's work. He's contributing editor of the magazines Ideas, Arts and Society in Cluj and Version in Paris and Cluj, and was a member of the editorial team for the magazine projects of Documenta 12 in Kassel in 2006-2007. In addition to contributing his writing to numerous magazines, books and exhibition catalogues, other recent curatorial projects include After the Final Simplification of Ruins, Forms of Historiography in Given Places, Centro Cultural Monte Hermoso Culturunea in 2009, and Like an Atelier Report but Different on Fiction and Political Imagination in Cadiz Art Foundation in Paris in 2008. Costinaş lives and works in Amsterdam and Utrecht. Tom Holert is an art historian and writer. He currently teaches at the Akademie der Bildende Künste in Vienna, From 92 to 96, Holert was editor of the journal Texte zur Kunst, and from 96 to 99, editor of the magazine Specs, both based in Cologne. He has written extensively on artists such as Jeroen de Rijk and Willem de Rooij, Nicole Vermers, Bettina Pusci, Katja Davar, Matthias Poledna, Mark Lewis, Pire Zimmerman, Sanja Ivekovic, and Omar Fast. He regularly publishes essays and studies in publications such as Art Forum, Beduin, Kamera Austria, Texte zur Kunst, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and many more. Holert lives and works in Berlin and Vienna. And Pablo Lafuente is a writer, editor, and curator. He's a co-editor of the journal After All in London and an associate curator at the Office for Contemporary Art Norway in Oslo. Lafuente has published his writing in catalogues and periodicals such as After All, Art Monthly, Parquet, Radical Philosophy, and The Wire, on topics including the possibility of criticism and the relationship between images and ideology. He's currently developing within After All a research project on the history of contemporary art exhibitions, and is also working on a PhD on political change in the work of Louis Althusser and Jacques Rancière at Middlesex University in London. Lafuente lives and works in London. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Shall I begin? I thought you would. Okay, good. Could we have the first slide, please? Maybe before I begin, I wanted to remind you of the alleged topic or the alleged subject of our discussion, which has been very nicely put by Cosmin for the abstracts. And I think what we are going to do in various ways is to actually address the kind of development and the range of roles of art and curatorship, the processes of knowledge production, and the question of how informal research, or more or less informal and formalized research, to be found in the art field, is also a way of presenting or offering a cross-disciplinarity, an interdisciplinary approach, which could be theorized in very different ways and also could be questioned in regard to current neoliberal interpellations of collaboration, participation, interdisciplinarity, etc., and which role or which function do the various activities of the 1990s within and without the art world have or had for this development and for this possibility or this urge of questioning. I would like to start by way of introducing and in a way framing my short input, because I was asked to present a kind of 15 to 20 minutes paper, and this is going to stay in this limits, I guess, I hope. By way of introducing, I would like to share with you a manifesto, a text published in the current issue of the German liberal weekly newspaper Die Zeit, written and signed by visual artists, performers, musicians, club promoters, journalists, and other cultural producers from Hamburg, by the way, my German northwestern hometown. Rather unusually, this text, which is called an artist manifesto, a Künstlermanifest, symptomatically not gendered in any way, or gendered very one-sidedly, which is called an artist manifesto only by the newspaper, is printed on the first page of the cultural section of Die Zeit, hardly edited though, and thus preserving the rather frank, outspoken character of the original text that can be read in its full length on the internet. unfortunately only in German until now. The so-called manifesto has been written at the occasion of an ongoing struggle about an old neighborhood in the center of Hamburg. The streets and buildings, most of them destined to be replaced by their current owner, a Dutch real estate investor and developer company, have been squatted this summer by artists from different backgrounds. They not only claimed the space for studios, flats, exhibition and concert venues, and confronted the city council with a rare alliance of different generations and political and cultural contexts. They also turned the squattings into a struggle against the policies of the revanchist neoliberal city, decrying the ideology of the creative city, refusing to speak about their city in terms of marketing. And the text is reminding its readers of a particular and nonetheless somewhat common and global urban subcultural politics and history. I'm quoting, translating, "We are coming out of squatted houses, out of fusty and smelly rehearsal rooms. We organize clubs in damp basements and empty department stores. Our studios were located in abandoned office buildings, and we preferred the non-developed old buildings since the rent was cheaper. In this city, we have always been looking for places that have fallen or dropped out of the market temporarily, because there we could be more autonomous and independent. Hence, we don't want to help now to increase the commodity value of those places. We don't want to discuss questions such as how do we want to live in workshops of urban developers. For us, everything we do in this city is involved with spaces of freedom, alternative and utopian designs, with the subversion of the logic of a politics of location and market speculation." One of the reasons for me to bring this campaign and this text to your attention is the fact that a number of the main activists and underwriters in this struggle for reclaiming a right to the city have been present already in a period when a politics of non-politicians, a non-politics or anti-politics of cultural producers of all kind, acting in heretofore unknown coalitions, have gained a certain visibility and notoriety in Germany after 1989, and especially after September 1991, when a series of neo-fascist pogroms, physical assaults and killings started in Hoyerswerda, a town in Saxonia in the former GDR, mainly directed against former contract workers from Vietnam who had used to represent an internationalist and or colonial dimension of the former East, followed up by fully mediatized racist riots for days on end at a home for asylum seekers in Rostock-Lichtenhagen, in again a city in the former GDR in August 1992, and further assassinations and assaults in Mölln, Mannheim-Schönau and Solingen in 1993, these times in towns on the territory of the former West German Federal Republic. The racist violence against migrants suddenly conveyed the nationalist as well as the international global dimensions of the reunification, and it entailed, if belated, reactions by a post-89 civil society that organized anti-racist demonstrations and a public debate, though hardly interested in a thorough critique of nationalist ideologies, neo-colonialities, the global dimensions of the fall of the wall, etc. And this cover of the Spiegel is one of the documents, or one of a series of very symptomatic publications that showed how the issue of migration of asylum had been instrumentalized in the months and years after the reunification, in order to kind of to harden the law on asylum and to restrict the possibilities and limit the possibilities of immigration in Germany. Out of a response to the 1992 pogroms in Rostock-Lichtenhagen and this very lack of an anti-nationalist, anti-racist debate and reaction, cultural producers, journalists, artists, musicians, political activists, and all kind of hybridizations of these categorized figures gathered in Cologne during the August 1992 Popcom, a business fair of the music industry, to organize a network of individuals and groups that had been hardly in immediate collaborative contact before. This network soon after baptized Wohlfahrtsausschüsse, committees of public welfare, somewhat crude reference to the Jacobinist Comité du Salut Public, of which I was a member, mobilized against the change of the right to asylum in the German constitution in 1993, organized a conference, published a reader, and probably most infamously embarked in 1993 on a sort of missionary expedition to cities in the former GDR, to Rostock, Leipzig, and Dresden, where meetings with anti-fascist groups took place, but also and anti-racist groups took place, but also lectures, public discussions, and concerts. I don't want to go too much into detail here, but as much as these activities may have suffered from inner factional disagreements and strongly differing attitudes toward political and/or cultural work, they nonetheless constituted a coalition across milieus and disciplines, bringing together usually conflicting styles and modes of operation and behavior, of performances of a very different kind, with very different backgrounds, that had been cultivated in a time, the 1980s and early 1990s, when subcultures have increasingly become separated and segregated monads, primarily occupied with erecting boundaries of distinction and creating something like a mainstream of minorities. The current struggles of the Hamburg activists against the ideologies and realities of the neoliberal creative city are strongly informed by the kind of debates and discourses, but also by the kind of organizing across the boundaries of subcultures, across the boundaries of milieus which had been very carefully and very strictly separated before. One of the outcomes of the 1980s had been strongly informed by the kind of debates and discourses developed in widening networks and of the so-called cultural left or pop left, Kulturlinke or Poplinke, of the early and mid-1990s that entertained close, if often complicated and difficult exchanges and communications with individuals and collectives in German-speaking countries that were more related to the art world proper, so to speak. So what are the contexts, the reasons, the urges to look back at, revisit, recall, and ultimately reconstruct or reinvent this rather recent, though seemingly far away past? Of course, to answer this question may be leading onto different routes, one of which could be a sort of telescoping or zooming in on particular historical moments, which one assumes to be of importance of symptomatic character or even explanatory value. Another avenue of responding to the prior question could be a sort of self-interrogation, taking a scrutinizing look in one's own involvements and or non-involvements in such moments, the role one might have played in the eyes of others, representing not only oneself as an empirical person X, but a particular position of power or powerlessness, of influence or non-influence, of being a producer or a recipient, etc. My reasons to revisit particular events, particular moments of the past 1989 period are diverse. For one, I am, out of selfish curiosity maybe, interested to revisit my own former self in the former West, casting an autobiographical glance on past and current roles as critic, audience member, researcher, denizen of a specific cultural geographic locus or site. In my case, that would be in the 1990s, among others, the city of Cologne, the editorial boards of the two magazines already mentioned, Text zur Kunst and Specs, the academic milieu, and others. Currently, and also due to my present institutional affiliations at the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, I'm occupied with the task to think through notions such as artistic research and knowledge production. This current concentration of my own research and my work as someone developing and implementing a practice-based PhD at the Academy stands in a pretty immediate relationship to episodes in the cultural and political thinking and production of the mid-1990s in Germany, but not only in Germany, but also in Austria and Switzerland. I'm referring here to a rather specific set of individuals, groups, milieus and institutions, a set that sometimes and infamously had been dubbed Zusammenhang, roughly translatable as context. Since the late 1980s, at different places in the former West Germany, but also, as I said, in Switzerland and Austria, in cities such as Cologne, Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Düsseldorf, Vienna and Zurich, probably most importantly Berlin, new or at least different modes of operating within and by the art world have been developing. These different modes of operation were aimed at an in-depth questioning of traditional and established roles of artists, curators, critics, etc., resulting in the by now almost legendary figure of the cultural producer. This subject of the cultural producer had precursors in productivist and activist figures such as the art worker or other hybridized post-artists such as the artist scientist, the artist engineer, the artist entrepreneur, the artist as anthropologist, etc. And especially, this should be added, the artist as activist. The late 1980s and 1990s, however, saw the emergence of the cultural producer as being someone moving and working in groups, collectively gathering, retrieving and disseminating knowledges, skills in a wide and ever-growing array of disciplines and practices. This expansion of competencies, and competencies should be understood here in the sense, both in the sense of capability as well as of legitimacy, that could be witnessed in this variety of curatorial projects, collaborative exhibitions, workshops, art spaces, publications, etc. This expansion of competencies put high pressure on the common notions, on the common and usual notions of what an artist group is supposed to be and how he or she how it is supposed to act and perform. I would like to, in coming to a conclusion, I would like to just to mention one of the various exhibitions, one of the various events which are going to be the theme, the subject of today's and tomorrow's discussion more thoroughly. Just want to single out one of those events which stood in the end of 1995 in a series, or which was part of a series of exhibitions and events which started in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and which came at this point in the mid-1990s to a sort of first resume. I would like to speak about the Messe 2 OK, which was a counterfare, so to speak, organized at the same time as the Art Cologne in November 1995 in an abandoned former postal service railroad station on the Mülheim side of the Rhine in Cologne, and it was organized by a group of artists, among them a number of artists which are now rather well known in the art world as being exhibited and published quite a bit, such as Andreas Siegmann, Klaus Weber, Alice Kreischer, Stefan Dillemuth. organized by this group. It was the effort, it was the attempt to, on the one hand, synthesize the diverse activities of groups that had been working separately and in a kind of non-aligned or non-communicative way, and which have been addressed beforehand by a number of invitations, which very carefully and very pointedly invited a number of individuals and groups to join in this fair, which wasn't to be just a mock fair, but something like a completely different kind of gathering between cultural producers of very different backgrounds. The proposal was a different kind of production and mediation or communication in relation to the common practices of the art world, the relations of production, the Marxist theory of value, the strategies of communication, relation not only to the art system but to a larger societal restructuring, new relations of power and exploitation, immediate relation to feminist, post-colonial and post-Fordist concerns. The various forms of presentations beyond lectures, discussions, panels, project presentations, readings, talk shows, hidden exhibitions, working groups, art fair-like booths, etc., should address, or were destined to address, subjects such as the commodity character and the autonomous subject, the commodity fetish, the artistic production as affirming economic developments, avant-garde and industrialization, avant-garde and neoliberalism, public task, demand, social relevance, the social relevance as interpellation, what is work, what is labor, aestheticization of processes of work in the art world, seemingly unalienated labor as a cultural ideal, allowing contracts beyond union wages, etc. How is labor, how is work conceived in the art world, appropriation, coping with translation, input-output research, agitprop. It is about how different axes of domination and exploitation function with each other, how capital, coloniality, racism, gender hierarchy, etc. intersect and meet while being highly specific at the same time. What about the public sphere? The fair was concentrating, focusing on very much on economic theory, and invited or included a number of theorists working in the sphere of economic theory, of political economics, in order to kind of reconfigure, reconstellate, rearrange, reassemble artists, but also practices. And this in this attempt to kind of redistributing and reorganizing and refocusing the work of very different the work and the practices of very different milieus and individuals and groups was also an attempt to address the kind of reorganization of society in terms of knowledge production, in terms of how cultural production has been inserted into the market logic, how the way artists are perceived and artists construct their own selves had become already very much part of a neoliberal reality, a neoliberal present, and the way rereading these documents, the catalogue, which had been published a year after the event, and which includes all kinds of, which is still a rich archive, which I strongly recommend to kind of to consult and to retrieve the documents from, is displaying a kind of a degree of awareness, a degree of consciousness of debates, of critical figures, of categories, which which I personally had almost forgot that they've been present at the time in 1995 in such a degree, with such clarity. The fact that I almost forgot about the kind of advanced positions presented at that occasion must have to do a lot with the kind of impression I got from the very gatherings there, from the very lectures and discussion groups, and the way things have been presented and organized throughout the days of the Messe to OK, because I had, as many others, had the impression that this is a discussion which is probably not as focused as it should be. The impression of diffusion or diffusity prevailed in many respects, a kind of pointlessness and a certain pseudo-radicality, things which had been criticized in the moment, but which had been criticized also, and this is something I should. I mean, I'm trying to address while asking how we as sitting here also kind of in what positions we are performing here as informants, as witnesses, as historians, as researchers. This is all rather unclear. That I should kind of question or interrogate my own position at the time vis-à-vis those developments, and how involved or non-involved I wasn't, why I wasn't involved in the way I, in hindsight, should have been, and so I kind of I'm kind of surprised about my own former self here, and about my own non-understanding of the revolutionary or of the progressive potential of those events, of this event in particular, which had a lot to do with the kind of distribution of competencies, of claims, the kind of claiming of a certain idea of art, or what an artist or what the art world should look like, which had been which was an extremely competitive situation between different cities, between the way, from a Cologne perspective, Berlin was perceived or conceived or constructed as being a place of a certain kind of anti-art political criticality or politicality, and how on the other hand Cologne has been conceived in very different ways as being the place where art, in the most emphatic sense of the word, was had still a high currency, and was only slowly being subverted by the activities of certain groups of institutions, or new institutions such as Friesenwald, or galleries like the Galerie Nagel, and so there was a certain kind of suspicion and a certain non-understanding, a systematic or non-understanding of the positions of others, which made it very difficult to appreciate the kind of activities manifested in Messe 2, okay, for example, the way they could have been appreciated. Though, for example, Text zur Kunst tried to include or endorse those activities through interviewing the participants, etc. So I'm kind of I would like to leave it here, and with a question, or with the hope that it would be possible to discuss, on the one hand, the way various practices within and without the art world had been come into a kind of alliance or coalition instigated and tailed by the political developments, by the racist programs of the post-1989 years at the one hand, and how developments such as the critique of the neoliberal city the revanchist neoliberal city, the idea of the creative city, had been developed in the course or in tandem, in parallelly to anti-racist, anti-fascist critiques of society at large, which had been then of a strong influence and strong altering influence on the art world as such, and how this could be, and how the very critique of traditional ways of art making and displaying and exhibiting had become part of a strong current which put, like in the 1960s, for example, the art production as a way of cultural production on the agenda as being something which is probably not of relevance any longer. So I kind of so one interesting could be to look closely at the way artistic production in the more traditional sense of the word had been allowed access to an event such as a Messe 2, okay, Messe 2, okay, and how the artists kind of denied their own methodologically denied their own, or methodically denied their own artistry in a way or in an effort to approach or to approach it or to reach a different level of discourse. Thanks.
Hello. I'm going to talk about something related to Tom's position. Is basically the first impression, the starting assumption is that in the 90s, different way of exhibition practice begins. One that allows this interdisciplinary relation to practices, this introduction of strange elements, exhibitions addressing different issues. But in order to get there, I'm going to try to build a history. First, a disclaimer, this was an emergency paper, so it's completely speculative. So maybe that's good for the discussion. But before doing a history of exhibitions, I think I need to say something about what it means, what contemporary may mean. And this was brought up yesterday, and it was criticized as, there's nothing contemporary. But contemporary could be a way of understanding a dispositive that allows us to understand where we are today. And so, how has contemporary been defined in relation to art? I'm going to give three different possibilities. And I'm borrowing all this discussion from Peter Osborne. First, contemporary art is, this is the publisher's definition. Contemporary art, Anglo-Saxon publishers at least, is what happens after 1945. This definition is completely aligned with the beginning of US hegemony. So it's completely geographically bound, and it's also aligned with the history of the avant-garde, or the neo-avant-garde. It begs lots of questions, such as, are we in the time of abstract expressionism? Well, probably the answer is no, but are we in the time of Duchamp? Maybe we are. But as a post-war definition, it also begs the question of when it finishes, and probably 89 is an easy answer to when it's finishing. So maybe we're not in that time anymore. Second, there is perhaps the most common definition, which is contemporary art starts in the 1960s, 1968 perhaps. This is less geopolitical, though still it has it's an ontological definition. Art changed in the sense that the primacy of the object was lost, and the primacy of the medium specificity of modernism disappeared. But while being ontological, there is still a geographical definition of it. I mean, the centers, that definition starts from New York or LA, New York, Western Europe, and then starts incorporating secondary moves, secondary elements as the secondary developments art from South America in the 70s and 60s, and later of Eastern Europe, for example, mostly after 89. But then there's another definition, another possible definition of contemporary art, which is determined by a political history, which is 89 is the end of an era, a political era that started in 1917, not in 1945, but 1917. If we are in a different political time, then there must be a different art. What is this art then? The logic of the avant-garde doesn't seem to apply anymore. No? There is also, there seems to be a stronger incorporation of the autonomy of art within, of the claim of autonomy of art within a cultural industry. And finally, there's something called globalization, with all its implications, whatever. So, in this time, in 1989, after 1989, how does art function differently from before? Peter Osman talks about something called a systemic functionalization of the autonomy of art, which means something like the uselessness of art is still a claim, but it's used as a claim to use that art to perhaps try to do something. Use the dispositive, the platform of art as a infrastructural, discursive platform from which to try to get into the world, which is something what we're doing here. No? If that is a possible thinking through of what the contemporary history of art may be, how can we apply that to exhibitions? Okay. As Maria said, we're doing and after all, we're doing this exhibition histories project, which is an attempt at researching whatever happened with contemporary exhibition practice. We called it exhibition histories because we realized that telling one history was impossible. In some way, you can understand these three periodizations that I just told as parallel, because the three of them in different intensities define where we are now, and define that positively or negatively. When we started talking about the project, we decided to we had to set a date, and the date that we set was 1955. Why? It's Documenta 1. But this date is equivalent to the publisher's definition of contemporary art. This is a post-war definition, in the sense that Documenta 1 was an exercise in recuperation of certain type of art. When it came to actually pick up the exhibitions that we are working on, we very much went to the second definition of contemporary, which is the late 60s. Exhibitions like When Artists Become Form, Oblosserschöven, Siegelaus exhibitions, Lucy Lippard's number shows. What's the characteristic of these exhibitions? Perhaps a struggle within an art context for an opening of the structures of the art production. The institution, the art, the figure of the artist. And this struggle had the form of an attempt to make social contradictions visible inside the museum, perhaps, but in a way that still art had the primacy. And also an attempt to free art from the museum and bring it out into the world. Before I go into the break, I think I have to say something about the 80s. Okay. So, in some way, you could understand the 80s as a return to the idea of art. And I'm going to do this through a double typology, two types of exhibitions that can be identified as key to the 80s, which is historical or historicizing exhibitions, and exhibitions that pose art as universal. The first ones, for example, 60-80 Attitudes, Concepts, Images, Stedelijk in 82, or Westkunst in 81 in Cologne, and Paris, Creations in France at the Pompidou in 81. In the catalogue of 60-80, Eddie de Wilde says that So the goal of the exhibition is not to present a graphic description of the evolution of the visual arts during the period mentioned in the title. It is almost an attempt to relive the memory of 2 decades that are among the most turbulent in the 20th century. Not only have we tried to align and confront the more relevant ideas and uncommon personalities of the period, but by doing so we are attempting to evoke an image of future developments. So here you can hear a parallel of this discussion of the avant-garde, this idea that we are going to think through the history in order to see the future, but through art practice. These exhibitions sometimes have used artworks and things that were not artworks as somehow evidence of this historical progress. And for example, when environments were constructed, like Oldenburg's store, it was in some way also to kind of provide this idea of evidence of this history. In the late 80s, perhaps there is a reaction to this, which is this idea of the art as universal. In 1988, Zeman said in an interview that art is fragile, an alternative to everything in our society that is geared to consumption and reproduction. And because of that, he has art needs to be protected, and the museum is the proper place for this. The museum is a house for art. Here, the autonomy of art is very much kind of the key, and it's about how to protect that autonomy. And of course, the museum is the place that has to do it. It's an autonomy that is in danger from capitalist co-option. The result of this attitude is exhibitions like Zeman's own the Hansen Gesamtkunstwerk or Rudi Fuchs' Documenta 7, perhaps. Ahistorical exhibitions that break through the boundaries of space and time without eliminating visual difference within the work. For that, you need the white space. You need the white cube from the 1920s as an area that can be filled up subjectively, and where works of art can constantly be rearranged to form new ensembles. What these exhibitions did is, by neutralizing the differences, question the historical notions that were being put at play before, and expose those historical notions as constructs. But at the same time, they lost that unity, the unity of historical narration. But in order to do that, or as a consequence of that, they provided art a new unity. The idea that there's a universal style of art, and that this is art that can appear as universal truth. Because of that, and I'm going to just finish that with the 80s, you could say that Maison de la Terre, which was an exhibition that has been considered a shift, an opening, a starting point to a new era, can be seen as very much belonging to that old era, in the sense that what that exhibition did is present work by Western and non-Western artists or non-artists, but claiming that there was this equality of creativity, whatever that may mean, and that these materials should be experienced equally. I mean, maybe you can argue that the equality wasn't such because the context where these materials were shown was the context where the Western work was made for, while the folk practices or the ritual sculptural practices were not made for that context. But the big claim was that this was universal art, this was art that could be immediately experienced, as that art that also had need to be exhibited in this kind of neutral, sacral space. In some way, La Villette has been commented often that it was a religious building, almost. So what happens in the 90s that is different from the 80s? What I want to say is that somehow exhibitions stop being exhibitions about art. And all these exhibitions I've mentioned are exhibitions about art. And start being exhibitions about perhaps the social. So any given subject, from homelessness to democracy to the public to the urban experience, cultural identity or cultural history, becomes the possible subject of the exhibition forum. it is true, and this is that you can find exhibitions done before that do that, like the City Plan, for example, or Tucumán Arde. I mean, there's going to be lots of examples that are going to destroy this spurious genealogy. But let's hope it's helpful anyway. But in order to think of, so what allows exhibitions to do this? What allows the exhibition forum to then suddenly not be about art anymore, but do something else? I wanted to kind of like try something out, but I don't know if, which is the idea that these exhibitions adopt the form of the essay. The essay, as Adorno, for example, talked about it. And he wrote a short text, the essay as form, in 1954, 58, in which he talks about production of knowledge which is opposed to the organized science. And I think that that's going to be relating to the things that Tom talked about. A rejection of the assumptions that knowledge has to come with its claims for universality and permanence. In opposition, he sees the essay form as something that invokes intellectual freedom. The essay does not let its domain be prescribed for it. Instead of accomplishing something scientifically or creating something artistically, its efforts reflect the leisure of a childlike person who has no qualms about taking his inspiration from what others have done before him. So ripping off is also fine. Its concepts are not derived from a first principle, nor do they fill out to become ultimate principles. Its interpretations are not philologically definitive and consensus. In principle, they are over-interpretations. I'm not saying that this applies to every exhibition done after 1990, but that this flexibility of form, this freedom of any form to deal with any content, this belief in the value of interpretation, and this refusal of the need of rigor, the necessity to apply rigor, are several of the characteristics shared by many or most of exhibitions after 1990. I'm not saying it is a good or bad thing. I think it's in general. I think that is the way it works, and that's the way that will help us look at them. So if this applies, then I'm going to do a really quick topology or partial topology of exhibitions in the 90s, which is really heavy with US examples, so I apologize for that. First, number one, thematic exhibition. So think of Blackmail, or think of the Whitney Biennial 93, or maybe Citizen and Move too. Or the Whitney Biennial introduces itself in the catalog. Yves Sussman, the curator, said it says that it's trying to present a refigured but fragmented collectivity in relation to cultural identities in the plural. So the idea is trying to deal with this identity politics in the US at the time. Thanks. She continues, we are living in a time when the form and formulation of self and community is tested daily. Communities are at war, both with and at their borders. Issues of nation and nationality, ethnic essentialism, cultural diversity, dissolution, and the politics of identity hang heavy in the air. These issues have urgency. For inherent to a museum of American art is the responsibility to question as we celebrate, to provoke as well as to conciliate. The museum may indeed be a place of sanctuary for a war-weary world. Yet its greatness lies in its ability to function simultaneously as a site for the contest of values and ideas essential for a peaceful society, to serve as common ground for many intersecting communities. Here is again a game of systemic functionalization of autonomy. The museum presents itself as an autonomous space, ignoring all the discussions from the 70s, a place that is alien to conflict, a place of peace, peaceful society, of quietness, but a place that because of that is allowed, or has the ability to talk about the conflict outside. And it's not clear here if they want to do something about it, but that claim is not made. In fact, I mean, the art institution is somehow shifts to the exhibition, becomes the privileged space for this political elucidation. And Coco Fusco says in that catalog also that culture in the US is critical, if not the most crucial area of political struggle. I mean, this could be read. I mean, there was also a quote that I forgot to put here by Maria Lind in the Manifesta Decade book that is actually the same. Somehow, this could be read as this drift that people like Perry Anderson have described as the drift of leftist thinking, communist thinking from the political context to an academic and cultural context. This kind of drift or refuge, or something that François Cousset did with the study of French theory, how French theory from the 60s travels to the US and travels from the political context to the literary department. But that's something that I think that very, very much shapes where we are now today, I think. I have two more really quickly. Number two, the meta-exhibition. An exhibition whose goal is to think of the relation of art to the rest of the world, or think of the relation of exhibition form to the rest of the world. I mean, you can think of perhaps Unité d'Habitation, or this is a show and the show is many things, or Documenta 12. There's a quote by Yves Ottone, who was the curator of Unité d'Habitation, who presented it as not an exhibition in the classical sense of showing works. Rather, it's an experimentation. The materials of this experimentation are organized around a central question. What could be the founding elements of a redevelopment of the aesthetic field and the artistic space? So, to that exhibition that happened in the Corbusier Habitation in Firmin in the south of France, in the disused part of it on the 7th floor, and 28 rooms, each given to one artist to do a project in them. It's 1993. So the exhibition posed questions about the relationship of art to architecture, design, the social modernism, domestic space, the media. But as Obeitalu says, it's not a matter of addressing these questions one after the other, but of intervening on the limits of these relations and to push these limits a bit further. Perhaps, for example, the last Istanbul Biennial is an attempt to think that through also. But yet again, the key here is not thinking of the history of art. I mean, the elucidation is not let's think through the exhibition form to think about the history of art, but think about how these exhibitions or how can art relate to this outside. And finally, my last type is the activist exhibition, and I'm thinking here of If You Lived Here by Martha Rosler and Democracy by Group Material, both at the very end of the 80s, actually, in the 90s. I'm going to start with a quote by Group Material. It says, our exhibitions and projects are intended to be forums in which multiple points of view are represented in a variety of styles and methods. We believe that we must focus on a policy of inclusion so as not to mirror oppressive structures. We're not interested in making definitive evaluations or declarative statements, but in creating situations that offer our chosen subject as complex and open-ended issue. We encourage greater audience participation through interpretation. I mean, this is remarkably close to Adorno's text. I mean, interpretation, non-definitive statements, diversity of styles, it's kind of like a copycat description. The main attempt here is, or one of the main attempts, is counteract this fetishization of the arts institution as different from the rest of society, following the 70s impulse. But there is something more. Yvonne Reiner, who was somehow responsible for selecting these two exhibitions, she was appointed by DIA with 4 other curators. Zeman was there and Kasper Koenig. It's all the same people throughout the whole history, selecting each other and appointing the same people. I think like today, I think it's the same also. Yvonne Reiner says, a vivid demonstration of how art exhibitions can constitute a radically different approach, one that can offer not only a diversity of objects, but can contextualize a social field in and from which the objects are produced and derive their meaning. In other words, art exhibition doesn't have to be separate or isolate its objects from the conditions in and under which those objects have been produced. They are a testimony to the value of art as a social force. So that the potential of art, Matt Rosler says in the book, of her exhibitions is to participate in the creation of social life. I mean, the organizational chaos of these exhibitions is the exhibitions were pretty messy. They also had a very strong discursive program. There were town hall meetings, and there were in which people were invited to participate, and there were also lectures about specific issues. Martha Rosler's was about homelessness, and general group materials was about democracy. So we're discussing about democracy and education and AIDS and cultural activity. But in here, the systemic functionalization that I mentioned before operates on a level that is even further detached from the idea of autonomy, in the sense that it is, again, this dispositive that what the mechanism art has access to, finance, a certain level of political independence, perhaps, and the social networks is what is put into play in order to talk about certain issues. I mean, some way you can think about that here, this context here, but I mean, there's something that is perhaps more present in the US than in Europe, perhaps because of the lack of political structures, or the refusal of political structures to negotiate social issues. For example, like there's this project that Rick Lowe is developing in New Orleans called Transformer Projects, in which basically the Warhol Foundation is at the end paying for house refurbishment. So, however, I mean, this is a very interesting proposal for what an exhibition can do or cannot do. But there are somehow political problems, perhaps, of definition, in the sense that the town hall meetings that happened, you can read that there was these pretty interesting books published of each of the exhibitions in which they transcribe everything. You realize that somebody sat down and recorded a town hall meeting. I mean, when do you record town hall meetings? So in some way, already there, in that point, the discourse had a symbolic presence. The introduction of this discourse in this exhibition forum had already a symbolic function. It wasn't about perhaps what had to be said, and it wasn't perhaps about what the conclusions were and what the exchange was, but the fact of having the discussion was what seemed important. Also because no matter what, the constituency of these discussions ends up being an art constituency. And I think that that's what kind of like some of the issues we'll be talking about, Thomas has been talking about, or we're talking about yesterday, is that what is that relationship to, once you want to get out, once you want to relate to, how do you establish that relation? And that's something that maybe Adorno's allowing for the lack of rigor, and this is perverse. I don't want to make Adorno responsible for this, but this lack of rigor is pretty damning when you claim to engage with certain kind of I don't know, outside political context. I mean, if you don't think through how do you do that, then what you are basically doing is staying in the mediation and not getting to the politics. I mean, in some way, if art mediates politics, you need to figure out how to go back, unless you think that everything is mediation, but then that's quite complicated. But yeah.
I think it would be interesting to start a discussion based on this point that Tom raised, and it's very much, of course, connected with what you just said, Pablo. And this is this a certain development in cross-disciplinary practices that we can see from the early 90s and late 80s, actually. And of course, this development came with a number of other developments in change of institutional structures, in the development of new agents of knowledge production, and perhaps even most importantly, with like a change in the condition of labor and employment of the people involved in this. But I wanted to just ask you back. On one hand, how did these changes were reflected in other fields of knowledge production? And of course, is this remaining a field of knowledge production? I mean, generally, and this is actually more a question to Pablo. later. And also taking into account certain developments in the methodologies of this practice and the rise of an informal types of research and then almost, as we said, an almost fetishization of research as a starting point of this.
Yes, I think both the notions of knowledge production and the notion of research had lived through quite significant semantic developments and shifts from the 1980s to today. I remember that Documenta 11 was very much based on the notion of knowledge production as being a kind of a mode of artistic production, of artistic involvement and artistic intervention and curatorial intervention. I think knowledge production is to be very carefully used as a name, as a notion, because on the other hand, it is the very idea of knowledge becoming a commodity, an academic, a scientific commodity, which is then turned into an issue of copywriting, of academic value production, and so on. But I think one should very much remind the current discussion around knowledge production on the emancipatory, on the liberating dimensions of the claim to be a knowledge producer within the cultural field, which is about claiming the right to do research, claiming to speak in the name of research and being a researcher and a knowledge producer, without having to become a member of the professional and academic establishment and the kind of and the acknowledged and legitimized ways of knowledge production at the same time. So I think this emancipatory potential of organizing oneself as an artist group, as a collective, around issues of knowledge, around issues of epistemology, of epistemic production, has been in a way disavowed or forgotten about or denied in the current discourse of artistic research, for example. And I think the way the field began to move and shift, the field of cultural activity in the 1990s is very indicative of the kind of potential which is somewhat denied in the notion of an academic, for example, artistic research PhD. And therefore, I think this the kind of redistribution of practices and of knowledges and of sensibilities in a way, or the sensorium in a way, which happened in the 1980s and 1990s, and which goes on until today in a way, should be contextualized very in a way to not homogenize and to not filter out the kind of heterogeneous and conflicting moments in this development by history writing and by educational policies, for example, and cultural policies. And I think there's the kind of rearrangement and reassembling and these new assemblies which happened in exhibitions such as Democracy or such as the Messe 2 event was was also on the level of performance and performativity, a way to address the lurking disciplining of the field, the kind of the way certain kinds of knowledge production or cultural production had been channeled into logics of the market, of location politics, as addressed by this Hamburg Manifesto, for example.
Yeah, but because if we're interested in this systemic shift, and if we really look at this significant mutation that happened in artistic practice, how would you link that with changes that occurred, of course, much earlier in the academic world, and not just in art education and in art-related research, but in the whole field of academia and its methods?
Shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I may have something to say about that. Is that I think that you're asking cultural studies, no?
Exactly.
That's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, somehow, I mean, where does cultural studies come from? In some way, it comes from the Maoist '60s, no? I mean, it comes from Maoism in France and the idea that anti-hierarchical knowledge production and looking for E.P. Thompson and looking for the voice. I mean, the voice of the people, the voice of the workers, and that's the political move that somehow validates what you are presenting as practice. No? But there's a long way to go from there to here, in the sense that then cultural studies takes that as its goal, and then takes it in, and then keeps it into academia, and then it starts slowly or really quickly or whatever, forgetting that the production of the interesting political element of the people speaking is lost, because at the end, whoever ends up speaking about anything is the academic. No? That freedom of that formal freedom, or that kind of like academic freedom of speech, remains that is validated by the freedom to have a voice, or the kind of actually the claiming of a voice of the worker or whoever into the ability of that who has a position to speak, and it was quite funny in the discussion here in one of the town hall meetings in the Martha Rosler exhibition. There's a big discussion about artists' right to how they kind of live in a space that they need. It's working, living in a space in New York, and making demands on the basis of their special needs, which, of course, was by some people in the meetings, like, what are you talking about? Basically, are your needs to be considered in parallel, or to like numerous families' needs? I mean, do you need a working, living space, while what about somebody who has like 10 children? Or I think it's important to claim this freedom of disciplines against an attempt by academy or by to sanction what type of knowledge production is, or how should things be said. No? And I think that's still a fight, but I think that it's good to also be reminded constantly of what validates your claim, or where does your claim come from. And I think that's not necessarily kept in mind often enough.
Yes, I think it's more a point of clarification. I was wondering what the global dimension is. You mentioned globalization, but what the global dimension is to these discussions. In other words, after '89, perhaps very arguably heralded by Musician de la Terre, but somehow it's come to justify that, or to represent that moment. The art world, the art context exploded internationally. I mean, contemporary art became something which wasn't restricted to a province of Northwest Europe and North America, but became something that was on all levels, no longer on smaller levels of kind of secondary practices in the socialist states or in Latin America, but somehow with Magician de la Terre there's an attempt to say that art is globalized. And I wonder what the presence of the global, or the presence of the non-West, the presence of the rest of the world in a sense was in Messe 2 OK. What was the relationship between what might be seen in terms of the formness of the West as the West exploding out so it no longer becomes meaningful, and the kind of local practices in Köln in the mid-90s, or indeed those exhibitions which also seem to be quite geographically specific that Pablo was talking about. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, to my memory, this dimension was rather absent, actually, and this was also obvious through the fact, for example, that the lingua franca of Messe 2 OK was German, and nobody who is not a German speaker could participate, and this wasn't really thought about, or this wasn't really made into an issue. Maybe at that moment it became more and more of an issue, but it wasn't at the time. It wasn't in the process of preparing and planning such an event. So this global or international dimension has been addressed by attributes such as post-colonial, but it wasn't really in the center of attention, in the center of interest.
Could I ask an additional question?
Sure.
Please? As somebody who's not part of the German-speaking world, the period you're describing is, for example, the period of the emergence of young British artists, which, notionally speaking, might rest longer in history in terms even of art products. I don't know about knowledge production. But the point is, what I'd like to ask is, which is a rather indecent question, you imply the existence of the whole community of various knowledge producers. But I want to understand what the economic base of all these people is. I know that in Germany you can go on doing PhDs until your mid-30s. It seems to me you're talking about a kind of situation in which, in these competing large capitals, there are huge, huge numbers of people who are an intellectual class, if you like, who have a vaguely proletarian lifestyle, but I don't understand if you're living on the dole or if you're all doing PhDs in German universities, or how you live or feed your, legitimate or illegitimate children or whatever. It seems to me like a huge international situationist. I don't mean to be sarcastic or rude or anything about it, but I'm very affected, having worked a lot on the 70s and revolutionary movements in France and things, by a book I read which hasn't been translated, by Bernard Rancière, called The Ideological Gaze, which is, absolutely heavy Maoism. And at the end of that he mentions a book by Ezra Suleiman, who is a sociological expert on intellectual communities, beginning with English public schools, incidentally, called The Elites. And it suddenly became blindingly apparent to me that, in fact, the French political and diplomatic structures, whose big concerns were France's third way and nuclear weapons and atoms and things, were with subsidies which I understand in terms of how these artists live, kind of condoning little Maoist eruptions here, there and everywhere, because they were actually completely meaningless in terms of the bigger plan. So I don't know, when you're looking back on your own former West self, how you see these kind of strangely economically supported, in some way I don't understand, communities of people talking about knowledge production with each other, ultimately producing what has to be classified in museums as ephemera. I just want to know how, looking back, you see this whole thing, and what kind of knowledge you actually come up with, because talking about knowledge production is one thing, and I don't see what the fruits, if you'd like to use a juicy term, what were the fruits of this? Also, I saw on the poster it said sponsored by. So basically, who sponsored Manifesto 2 OK?
The Messe 2 OK, it wasn't. That's an interesting point. the Messe Tour was very much about sponsorship and whether and how one could or should be sponsored, and there was the organizational team was in a month-long discussion with Siemens, who just initiated a cultural funding program, and Siemens offered to fund the Messe Tour, but the people organizing the Messe Tour wanted to have Siemens sign a contract which very much in detail rendered the kind of value gains on both sides, and this has been after month-long negotiations has been rejected by the organizing team because Siemens didn't really move, and so they decided not to become sponsored by Siemens, and instead they raised money from the participants. Everyone participating in the program invested 100 marks at the time, and as they got this space, this venue for free, and so they could somehow precariously manage to organize this. So this was the question of the economic base and the political and cultural economies of artistic and knowledge production was very much in the center of the Messe Tour discussions, and very differently. I mean, it's hard to generalize. I mean, some of them were on the dole, some of them were funded by grants, some of them had had money from their parents. I mean, of course. I mean, what you're addressing is the elitist character of those discussions, behaving as being a proletarian or precarious underclass of intellectuals, and this wasn't really the case. I mean, nobody denied that this is still, though underfunded and no budget, this is still a very privileged position to speak from. I mean, the way of intellectual discourse generated in such a realm, and therefore there's. I really don't get. I mean, is it a comparative question, comparing one political economy and one society to another, to the British, to the German system, or the American? I don't really see the point.
Yes, sorry, I'm Sarah Wilson from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, which is kind of old, humanities-based, traditional, but exploding institution. So, I don't know what to say about that. But the fact is, for example, in England, there's a skepticism about intellectuals in general, and there's a smaller intellectual community, and it's not sponsored and financed in the same way. And therefore, whereas there was a kind of pressure on artists who wanted to become artists, and let's not mention Damien Hirst, to actually change artistic paradigms in a way that had the result we all know about, it seems a very different kind of economy in which the word knowledge production, while living in visual culture departments in various university and old polytechnic structures, it was very different from yours. It seemed to me that in this German language space there was a broader base and an acceptance of the importance of knowledge production in a way that's different from the imperatives of somebody wanting to be an artist at Goldsmiths or something. Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about the different changes of, art practice, it didn't all just completely dissolve. So, I mean, it just seems to me that when one comes into as a kind of alien into the German language-speaking network. One sees a whole enormous network of support, which is extremely different from the situation in Britain or in America or something, which affects the products of the support. And I don't want to keep talking, but I just would like to say up about exhibition productions that there's an immense amount of research about these big exhibitions which relate to the museum's archives and the curatorial projects at the time and things. And I wonder to what extent the free-floating intellectual discussion, what its relationship is to the archives of the actual exhibitions, because I find it, again, very free-floating, having participated in some of those exhibitions myself.
Just very briefly, because this is an interesting question and remark, and I think one could speak about it for quite a while. I would like to emphasize that the enormousness of this support wasn't that enormous, really, and it was a very one has to relativize. I mean, maybe the impression is the wrong one I got, because I just showed this one thing, and it was very hard to find. And it still is. It's very hard to find funding for events such as this. There is a certain structure or infrastructure of funding which has developed. There's the federal foundation of, for example, Bundeskulturstiftung is one of them. But it's very hard to get to this money, and so what happened in the UK for quite a while, for example, is the shifting, the moving of artistic knowledge production to academia and to the art schools and into these new MA and PhD programs, and there you are competing directly with the science community, with the scientific community for funding and this is so there's a relocation or a relocation of those practices into academia to be witnessed, and I very much I'm very I think it's extremely necessary to contest this shift and to ask what reasons and what outcomes it has.
I want to say something about that. I think that I'm going to maybe speak for Tom, but maybe just tell me if I'm not saying that thing. But I think that what we're trying to elucidate here is what is characteristic of the 90s. I think that the fact that people are doing stuff that we're doing before doesn't mean, when Marx talks about the advent of capitalism doesn't mean the immediate disappearance of feudalism. Elements remain, and I think that you could consider, historical change through revolution, through epistemological break, through paradigm change. That doesn't mean that every type of practice is going to have to change. Practices remain. And history is not just some line in which, cut off. So the fact that British artists in the 90s stuck to object production, that may mean that there is different tradition that hasn't engaged with new development because of many reasons. At the same time, there are people who did it, and in some way, some bit of Maoist thinking may be good here to bring in, which is that it's important to think through where people come from and how they're able to do things, but also it's good to give room for people to do something that is not determined by where they come from. So let's not be Bourdieu here. It's important, I think, because if you think that whatever you do is determined by your income and your family history and where you are, then things won't change ever, I think. And I think that that's important to have a balance. And in terms of the history exhibitions thing, I don't know if your question was this, but the idea is somehow actually archives are actually much less, actually archives are really bad. The institutions haven't archived their material, like Pompidou, for example, has an extremely poor archive of Maison de la Terre. Actually they have pictures and that's it, and some faxes. So it's true, it's completely true. Because it happened in La Villette, and people took home part of their work. There's some faxes at Pompidou, but that's it. and the press pack, the press review pack. The whole thing is some kind of like puzzle making that you're trying to kind of like reconstruct it through talking to people and finding bits and pieces. So it's kind of like some detective work that somehow shows that it's impossible to tell a story, then you have to tell like completely conflicting histories. And that's the case with Exhibition 69, but also from 89. I mean, we're doing a book on Havana 89, and that's, I guess that Cuba is not going to be the easiest place to find people to, speak, but what you find is that there's so many different versions that you have to juggle them, and archives are really not there.
Can somebody else come in? Pablo, I want to maybe follow up on Charles's question about your genealogy of exhibitions and so on, and perhaps to try to reconcile for me how your periodization squares with the idea of definition of the contemporary. I'm sort of puzzled by the fact that you use periodization as a definition of what contemporary is. And speaking specifically about the institutional logic of post-45, post-60, and so on, it seems to me that there is a great deal of confusion on your part in trying to sort of describe a landscape in which different ways of categorization give rise to some forms of types of institutional memory of what artistic production is. So maybe you can just to link up why this period, how this periodization comes to become the definition of the contemporary, not just simply contemporary art. Maybe if you can, draw that out for, a little bit.
I think that I can. I don't think I can propose like a philosophy of history, but I think that you have to. I think that. The goal here was thinking through where we are. Right? And in order to do that, you have to think of what defines the moment where you are. This project is a very clear example of picking up 89 and maybe test it. I hope it's about testing whether 85 defines where we are. And I think that that's perhaps also again like Maoist, it's not again Maoist, like a conception of how politics happen through some kind of shifts, and so kind of breaks that define how social organization works. And you can think 1789 is very much for I think for the whole world, I would say, a key point of definition. I mean, it somehow you can think that there is some ideas of equality that either effective or not.
I'll always be careful in not really universalizing
But
historical events and applying it to the rest of the world. Because the point I'm trying to make is, Pablo, that if you were to sort of to look at the genealogy of exhibitions in the United States, to forget that what gave rise to the founding of Studio Museum in Harlem and Museo El Barrio in 1969 was an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, which was, so what I'm trying to say is, this genealogy is a false genealogy.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in a sense, does not begin to sort of to describe what you began with as histories of contemporary art. Because what we are really hearing is a rehearsal of the mythos of contemporary art or contemporary art exhibitions. And I think, because for me, if you really want to sort of to look at the genealogy of an exhibition like Magicien de la Terre, we have to look at Rick Burnett's exhibition in 1986 in South Africa, Tributaries, or from which some of the artists in Magicien, were borrowed, in fact, because it was precisely an attempt to relativize the relationship between urban and rural artists, which then was universalized in the context of Magicien. So we need to dig deeper. We need to do a more thorough historical, research to sort of to understand the key mechanisms of why these ruptures, create a landscape of possibility. And the way I think that we do that is not by absolute categories. So if I were to borrow from Sarat's small change of the universal or the small change of the absolute, is to really to set these things contiguously next to each other and not as this kind of paradigmatic, breaks. And let me just finish to give you one example with Documenta 5. And in 1971, or late 1971, Zeman invited David Medalla to the exhibition, of which Medalla wanted to introduce him to a number of his Brazilian artist friends, namely Elio Iteseka and Ligia Clark. And this is in the archive of Documenta if you're keen to go and look at the letters. And those two artists were specifically denied participation because Zeman did not think that they were ready for Documenta. Yeah, he did not think they were ready for Documenta. And of which then Medalla's project in Documenta 5, A Stitch in Time, which continued, was an attempt to produce a collective work in which all those artists whom were not invited were then sort of invited in a kind of meta exhibition that he produced through this project of people's teaching. So I'm trying to sort of to remind ourselves that that 89 itself is not an absolute date, but more like a conceptual frame around which to think about the density of historicity.
Absolutely, I was alluding to, that what 89 is a symbolic date. It says that what allows you to think a series of issues, that political developments, cultural developments, that shape where we are today. About really menial point about Documenta has been the exhibition that has historized itself, very much so. I think that was part of the project from the beginning. So of course Documenta has everything there, but I don't think that's the case in general. But of course you have to, of course if you have to think of, we were doing a book about if you lived here or group material, the genealogy is ACT UP. Okay, I haven't dealt with that, but this is 80s artistic practice from New York, activism. But what I was trying to do here is not do specific case studies. If I had done that, then I would have done that. But what I was trying to do is that in order to go into a field that I would argue, and I think that I have pretty lots of ground to that this area of investigation hasn't been dealt with at all. In the German context, perhaps with Documenta, it has been done, for example. But I think that if you look through bibliography about conceptual art exhibitions, it hasn't been talked about from the perspective of the exhibition, how the exhibition formed, that's it. And the same with the 80s. I think that there is not enough bibliography to claim, this Risa Greenberg's book is fantastic, but there's not enough of bibliography to then kind of go into detail. So then you have to start somewhere. You have to start trying to delimitate some generalities to then destroy them. If you don't do that, that's the way that academic work needs to happen. If you don't do that, where do you start? You can then say, okay, you start with specific cases. But the specific cases need to be chosen for some reason. How do you decide that you're going to do a book about Maison de la Terre? Instead of doing it about, primitivism, or instead of doing it about, Sao Paulo 98. You have to there's a limited amount of resources. And then if you have to act, then you have to somehow draw a map that then you are in charge of, taking down, and then others will come and actually just, turn it around. But that's the only way of, I think, working in cultural production. Of course, but the critique is part of the initiative. But it should start somewhere. I think that there's no other way.
I have a suggestion because, you also felt that there were some tensions here in the rows, also in relation to the method 2OK and some of these things. And I think I have a suggestion because I believe it would be good to map really a kind of, to have a transnational map. A map of entanglements, of influences. Actually, I met Simon at the Method 2OK They didn't talk in English because in that time many Germans were not able to speak English. I mean, we forget this. Yeah. This is part of the move of globalization, that we are all trained to speak Euro-English. Yeah. It wasn't possible, but I met Simon there. And so another forms of collaboration started, which went beyond this kind of limitations. You know? And also in terms of the transnational history of if you lived here, I mean, I will talk a bit about this. This had a large impact on a German-speaking leftist cultural production. But this was not just the exhibition, but there was also kind of a transversal in the exhibition. You know, all this kind of groups and discourses and also series is also something which actually the first panel would have talked about. It was so central what we read, you know, and what we shared. And also it was very central what was translated. You know, because of the lack of translations, we were quite late also in keeping up with cultural studies in Germany, with keeping up with post-colonial theory. I mean, we were quite fast with feminist theory, one has to say, you know, because this was early translated. Yeah? And we were very fast with post-operatic assaults, because that was early translated. And I think this is also a map of influences and how we kind of formed our communities. And I think it would be better than creating again aesthetic or kind of categorizations or periodizations which kind of fall back somehow into specific historicism. Yeah.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, everybody. Our mind map, the way we started yesterday, or perhaps even the list of tasks to do, is growing. And that's very exciting. Before we continue in engaging with all these tasks, I would like to propose a 30-minute break. Invite you for coffee, tea. If you split yourself in between mezzanine and hall, we just manage in 30 minutes, and I look forward to seeing you here at 12:30. Thank you very much.